The Supreme Court chamber went quiet as Representative Jasmine Crockett walked to the podium. Her bright green outfit stood out against the dark wood walls of the court. A moment before, Justice Clarence Thomas had leaned into his microphone, a smirk causing a stir in the room. "Rep," he said slowly, his deep voice filling the space. "Perhaps you should review basic legal principles before addressing this court." The unexpected comment made the audience gasp. Murmurs spread as Crockett gripped the podium, her knuckles turning white. Thomas, with over 30 years on the bench, seemed to think he could intimidate the new congresswoman from Texas. But when Crockett took a deep breath and looked directly at Thomas, her intense gaze suggested otherwise. This Harvard law grad clearly wasn't going to let a Supreme Court justice question her legal skills, especially not in front of the entire country. Before we get into this showdown, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more political clashes you won't see on mainstream news. The day began as usual in the Supreme Court building. The 9 justices entered in their traditional dark robes, ready to hear arguments about a contested voting rights case. The air buzzed with anticipation as journalists and legal observers filled every seat, knowing this case could change the country's voting system for years to come. Justice Clarence Thomas sat confidently at the bench, his presence commanding attention. At 76, Thomas is the longest-serving justice on the court, appointed by President George H.W. Bush in 1991. Right-leaning news outlets praise him as the court's unwavering advocate for originalism, pushing back against what they call progressive overreach. Known for his many opinions, Thomas has also gained a reputation for his sharp questions and sometimes pointed remarks to lawyers he thought weren't prepared. This morning, he seemed especially ready for a fight, reviewing his notes intently and occasionally whispering to Justice Samuel Alito beside him. Representative Jasmine Crockett was there representing voting rights groups, challenging a Texas law that opponents claimed disenfranchised minority voters. At 43, Crockett has built an impressive background. Harvard law grad, criminal defense attorney, former state representative, and now a freshman congresswoman from Texas's 30th district. Known for her direct, no-nonsense style and sharp legal mind, Crockett has quickly made a name for herself in Washington as a rising star who won't back down from a battle. Tension filled the room. Right-wing media had been attacking Crockett for days, questioning whether she was qualified to argue before the Supreme Court. "Just another diversity hire," one commentator sneered on a popular cable show. "She's in over her head," said another. These comments had clearly reached Thomas, judging by the knowing glances he exchanged with other conservative justices before the session began. Crockett got to the courthouse early. Her legal team was all around her with stacks of files and old rulings. She looked calm, even with all the noise outside, and checked her papers one last time. She'd faced tough judges before, but this was the Supreme Court. Taking on Justice Thomas, who was against expanding voter rights, would be the biggest test of her career. When Chief Justice Roberts called the case, Crockett walked to the podium. She started clear and simple, explaining how the Texas law broke Part 2 of the Voting Rights Act. She barely got going when Justice Thomas raised his hand to ask a question. "Representative Crockett," Justice Thomas said, sounding a bit superior, "I've read your brief, and I can't find any real legal argument. Maybe you should look at some basic legal stuff before you talk to this court." The room went quiet. It was rare for a judge to be so openly rude to a lawyer in the Supreme Court. Everyone looked at Crockett, wondering if she would fall apart under Justice Thomas's attack. Justice Thomas wasn't done. He leaned forward and waved his hand dismissively. "Your whole case seems based on feelings, not legal facts. This is the Supreme Court, not a political rally where you can play to the cameras." The conservative side of the audience almost smiled. Justice Thomas had been getting bolder lately, but this direct attack on a lawyer's legal skills was shocking, even for those who watch the court all the time. Reporters quickly scribbled notes, knowing this exchange would be the headline. Crockett didn't move, keeping eye contact with Justice Thomas. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but firm. "Justice Thomas, with all due respect, I'm here as a lawyer who has handled over 100 cases and won most of them. My law degree from Harvard is as good as yours." Justice Thomas raised his eyebrows at her direct reply. He wasn't used to lawyers pushing back. "Qualifications don't make arguments, Representative. I'm still waiting to hear legal reasoning, not political talking points." Several conservative justices nodded in agreement. Justice Alito even smirked, sharing a look with Justice Thomas. They were making it clear they saw Crockett as an outsider. Crockett didn't back down. "If you'll let me continue, Justice Thomas, I'll address the legal precedents directly." She started listing cases like Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, Shelby County versus Holder, and Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, breaking down the relevant parts carefully. But Justice Thomas interrupted again, his tone even more dismissive. "Those cases don't support your position, Representative. Maybe if you had clerked for a Supreme Court justice like I did for Judge Danforth, you'd understand the nuances you're missing." The tension in the room was thick. Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat but didn't say anything. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson looked bothered by Justice Thomas's personal attack but kept her usual neutral expression. Crockett took a deep breath, clearly gathering her thoughts. "Justice Thomas, I'm very aware of the precedents. What you might not know is that before I joined the legislature, I personally handled 7 voting rights cases in federal courts and won 5 of them." Justice Thomas waved his hand again. "District courts are nothing like this court, Representative. Federal courts, Justice Thomas," Crockett corrected him calmly, "including the Fifth Circuit, which, as you know, is one of the most conservative in the country." A murmur went through the audience. Justice Thomas looked a bit embarrassed at being corrected, especially on a detail he should have known. Justice Sotomayor looked up from her papers, suddenly more interested in the exchange. Justice Thomas changed tactics. "Your brief keeps talking about structural barriers and historical discrimination, political buzzwords that have no place in legal analysis. The 15th Amendment is clear, and emotional appeals don't change its language." Crockett nodded, like she knew this was coming. "Glad you brought up the 15th Amendment, Judge Thomas." She reached into her folder and pulled out a paper. "I have your own words here, from when you disagreed in Holder versus Hall. You wrote a lot about why we need history to understand the 15th Amendment." Thomas looked annoyed. He didn't think she'd come armed with his own statements. Crockett went on. "You wrote, and I quote, 'To get what the 15th Amendment is about, you have to peek at what was happening when it was passed.' Those aren't my words, Judge Thomas. They're yours." The other judges tried to look neutral, but Judge Kagan couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Thomas's words were being used against him, and it was done well. Thomas recovered fast. "History is important, lawmaker, but you're picking and choosing what to show." "I can give you the whole story," Crockett said, taking out more papers. "In that same decision, you talked about the specific barriers to voting back then. The Texas law we're fighting today creates similar barriers." Thomas looked even less happy now. Things weren't going his way. The lawmaker wasn't just defending her point. She knew his legal thinking inside and out. "Those things are different," Thomas argued, his voice getting louder. "And frankly, your take on it shows you don't really get original meanings teaching. That's why we need experienced high tribunal presenters, not government officials pretending to be lawyers." He was obviously trying to rattle Crockett, reminding everyone that she was a lawmaker first and a lawyer second. The right-leaning people in the audience nodded in agreement. One right-wing commentator even said loudly, "She's out of her depth." Judge Barrett seemed uncomfortable with how personal things were getting, tried to change the subject. "Maybe we should focus on the specific parts of the law instead?" But Thomas interrupted her, which is rare at the panel. "No, I think it's important to know if the presenter knows enough to guide this tribunal right." The space went quiet again. Thomas had gone too far, questioning Crockett's basic skills in front of everyone. Crockett didn't move, her gaze steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but everyone could hear her. "Judge Thomas, I've worked on over 100 cases in national tribunals. I've presented before the 5th Division 7 times. I completed with honors from Harvard Legal, just like you. And most importantly, I've spent years representing people who were directly hurt by voting limits, like the ones in this case." She paused, then added, "If you want to compare our record when we began appearing in tribunals, I'm happy to, but I think we both know that's not what this is about." A lot of people gasped. Crockett had just subtly pointed out that Thomas's career as a lawyer wasn't that great before he became a judge, which is not talked about often in the high tribunal. Thomas's mouth tightened. He didn't think the lawmaker would hit back this hard. Judge Sotomayor looked down, maybe to hide a smile. Even primary Judge Roberts seemed surprised by what was happening. The argument got really intense when Thomas implied Crockett didn't get the latest court rulings on ballot protection. "Your whole argument ignores our decision. In Brnovich," Thomas said, firm, "we made it clear that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act doesn't give you the broad protections you're claiming." Crockett nodded calmly. "I know Brnovich very well, Judge Thomas. Actually, I've done a detailed study on how this case is different." She pulled out another paper from her folder. "Unlike the Arizona rule in Brnovich, the Texas law creates problems that unfairly hit certain groups in ways that the Arizona case didn't." She started going through the differences point by point, citing specific parts of the Brnovich decision, and showing showing how the Texas law differed in important ways. She knew the ruling inside and out, and even some of the conservative judges started taking notes. Still, Thomas seemed determined to rattle her. Your analysis glosses over Judge Alito's clear statement about the limited scope of Section 2. With respect, Judge Thomas, Crockett replied, I'm not glossing over it. I addressed it directly on page 27 of our brief. Judge Alito's decision still said that voting methods that have a big uneven impact could violate Section 2 in the right circumstances. We've provided lots of statistical evidence showing exactly that kind of impact. Thomas frowned, looking over the brief as if to check her claim. Finding she was right, his frown deepened. Numbers can be twisted, Congresswoman, he said, dismissing it. Anyone with basic legal knowledge knows that. Crockett nodded again. They definitely can be, Judge Thomas. That's why we had our approach reviewed by statistical experts from 3 different universities, including one who used to testify for the conservative side in the Shelby County case. Their agreed findings are in Appendix B. She was anticipating his arguments, countering them before he could fully make them. The audience watched, fascinated as the dynamic shifted. Thomas, usually in total control of these interactions, found himself having to change his approach repeatedly. The core problem with your argument, Thomas tried again, is that you're asking this court to rewrite laws instead of interpreting them. That's not our job, as you should know. I'm doing no such thing, Judge Thomas. Crockett replied firmly. I'm asking the court to apply the Voting Rights Act as written and intended. Section 2 clearly prohibits voting practices that lead to a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen to vote based on race or color. The statistical evidence shows exactly that kind of abridgment. Judge Kagan leaned forward, seemingly interested in following this line of reasoning. Congresswoman Crockett, could you elaborate on... Thomas interrupted. Before we go down that road, I'd like clarity on whether the Congresswoman understands the limits Shelby County placed on federal oversight of local election laws. It was an unusual breach of protocol for one judge to interrupt another, and Judge Kagan's face showed brief surprise before she leaned back, yielding the floor. Crockett didn't miss a beat. Judge Thomas, Shelby County eliminated the coverage formula in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which determined which areas were subject to preclearance under Section 5. It didn't change Section 2, which is the basis of our challenge today. She continued with impressive detail. Actually, Chief Justice Roberts specifically noted in the majority opinion that our decision in no way affects the permanent nationwide ban on racial discrimination in voting found in Section 2. I'm not asking the court to overturn Shelby County. I'm asking it to uphold Section 2, which remains completely intact. Thomas looked briefly speechless. The Congresswoman's command of the court's rulings was undeniable. Judge Alito leaned over and whispered something to Thomas, who nodded slightly. Okay, let's forget about legal stuff for a sec, Thomas said, switching gears again. The core thing is, you're asking this court to swap its opinion for the Texas legislatures. He asked, why should 9 unelected judges trash the way an independent state runs its business? It was a standard right-wing argument, but Crockett was ready. Judge Thomas, she said, in Marbury v. Madison, Chief Justice Marshall made it clear that it's the court's job to say what the law is. If a state law butts heads with the Constitution or federal law, what the nation says wins. She paused, adding, and it's worth pointing out that you haven't been shy about axing state-approved laws you thought were unconstitutional, like parts of the Ballot Protections Act in Shelby County. The question isn't if this court can look at state election laws. Of course it can. The question is if this specific law breaks Section 2, and the facts show that it does. The liberal judges were practically drooling with interest. Crockett was holding her own against one of the court's toughest questioners, shooting down his legal arguments one by one. Thomas looked less dismissive and more just plain annoyed. His next question had an edge to it. Your numbers show unequal impact, but that alone isn't enough to prove a Section 2 violation. You know that, right? Of course, Judge Thomas, Crockett replied. That's why we aren't just relying on unequal impact. We've got piles of evidence on all 5 things in the Jingles test, like the history of prejudice in Texas, how segregated voting is in the affected areas, and how weak the states. Reasons are for the law. She pulled out another paper. Actually, we even have statements from the bill's supporters that show discriminatory intent, like Representative Johnson saying the law would make sure the right kind of people were voting. Thomas's eyes widened a bit. This was something he clearly didn't expect. Those statements aren't in the record, he said sharply. They are, Judge Thomas, Crockett corrected him smoothly. Page 42 of the appendix. The district court specifically mentioned them in its findings of fact, which the Fifth Circuit didn't challenge. Thomas flipped through his papers, clearly unhappy to see she was right again. This lawyer had come become seriously prepared, anticipating his every move. The debate was going on longer than usual for a single judge's questioning, but nobody seemed to want to stop it. The whole courtroom was hooked on this mental battle. Thomas took one last shot at undermining Crockett's credibility. "Counselor, your arguments today seem to contradict positions you took in an amicus brief just 2 years ago in the Harrison case. Were you wrong then, or are you wrong now?" It was a clever trap. The Harrison case involved similar voting rights issues, and Thomas clearly thought Crockett would be caught off guard. Instead, she smiled slightly. "I know the Harrison case, Judge Thomas, though I didn't personally file an amicus brief in that one. Maybe you're thinking of Counselor Barbara Harrison, who did file such a brief. We get mixed up sometimes because we both went to Harvard Law." A murmur rippled through the audience. Thomas had made a factual error, confusing Crockett with another black lawyer. It was an awful moment that undercut his whole line of questioning. Thomas's face flushed. He shuffled his papers, visibly flustered. "I might have misspoke," he admitted grudgingly. Chief Justice Roberts, sensing things were getting heated, finally jumped in. "I think we should hear from the other judges now." But the damage was done. Thomas, who initially doubted Crockett's basic legal skills, had been outdone by her better prep and grasp of the facts. The power dynamic had totally flipped right there in front of everyone. Even though the tension in the courtroom was thick, Crockett stood firm, composed despite Thomas's constant questions. Clearly annoyed by her steady answers, the judge went for one last jab. "Counselor," Thomas said, his voice dripping with arrogance, "I've been on this bench for over 30 years. I've heard arguments from the sharpest legal minds in the country, and I have to say, your understanding of basic legal principles is one of the most politically biased and legally shaky I've ever come across." Gasps filled the room. Even for Thomas, this was a huge breach of courtroom manners. Several judges shifted uncomfortably. Judge Kagan looked at Chief Justice Roberts, clearly waiting for him to intervene, but he seemed stunned by Thomas's completely out-of-line comment. Crockett took a deep breath. The whole place went silent, waiting for her response. This was the moment that would define not just the case, but her reputation as a legal advocate. She straightened her arms and looked straight at Judge Thomas. "Judge Thomas," she began, her voice clear and steady, "in your 1995 ruling in Missouri v. Jenkins, you wrote that we must remember that the Constitution doesn't stop us from looking to the future. You also stated that we shouldn't ignore the existence of a legal system that has systematically excluded large portions of the American population." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Those aren't my words, Judge Thomas. Those are yours." Thomas's face tightened as he heard his own words thrown back at him, perfectly quoted. "And in your opinion, in Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District versus Holder," Crockett went on, "you acknowledge that the past experiences of minority groups in this country must inform our understanding of basic protections." She calmly flipped to another page in her folder. "And in your speeches at the University of Florida Law School in 2010, you stated that the court must always guard against laws that seem neutral on the surface, but in reality work to deny rights." Thomas's lips parted slightly, then closed. He clearly didn't expect Crockett to have such a good handle on his own legal philosophy and public statements. "So, Judge Thomas," Crockett said, her voice growing stronger, "I'm not offering a politically motivated interpretation of the Constitution. I'm offering one consistent with ideas you yourself have expressed throughout your career." She placed both hands on the podium and leaned forward slightly. "The difference isn't in our understanding of basic legal principles. The difference is that I'm applying those ideas consistently to protect every citizen's right to vote, regardless of their race, zip code, or political affiliation." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Sotomayor looked down, probably hiding a smile. Judge Jackson sat up straighter, clearly impressed. Even some conservative judges seemed surprised by the force of Crockett's response. Thomas's face had darkened into a deep frown. He clearly hadn't expected to be so completely countered with his own statements and ideas. For a few moments, he said nothing, clearly struggling to come up with a response that wouldn't further damage his position. "You're taking my words out of context," he finally said, but he sounded less sure of himself. "I'm happy to look at the full context of any of those statements, Judge Thomas," Crockett replied calmly. "I brought all the decisions and records with me today." She touched the big folder in front of her. "Every statement I mentioned has the page numbers." Thomas glanced at his fellow conservative judges but didn't get any quick help. Judge Barrett was staring at her notepad. Judge Alito's expression was hard to read. Chief Judge Roberts was about to jump in, admitting the discussion had gone past legal arguments into awkward territory. Before Roberts could speak, Crockett gave her final answer. Judge Thomas, you started by questioning my legal skills and suggesting I needed a basic review. I've replied by showing I know this court's rulings very well, even your own legal thinking. I've cited specific cases, repeated exact words, and used those ideas for the matter we're talking about today. Standing up straight, she spoke firmly but politely. If you want to talk about the legal merits of this case, I'm ready. But if you'd rather doubt my skills instead of my arguments, I think what just happened speaks for itself. The audience made quiet noises. Experienced court watchers exchanged knowing looks. In the press area, reporters quickly jotted notes, knowing they were seeing a memorable moment in the court's history. Thomas leaned back in his chair, looking surprised. The judge, who had started by rudely suggesting Crockett needed a basic review, had just gotten a lesson on his own legal views from the woman he'd tried to embarrass. Chief Judge Roberts finally found his voice. I think we should move on to questions from Judge Kagan, he said firmly, trying to get the session back on track. But everyone in the room knew what they had just seen. Jasmine Crockett, the new congresswoman from Texas, whom Thomas had dismissed as unqualified, had not only defended herself, she had skillfully taken apart his attacks by using his own words and ideas against him. As questions continued from other judges, the atmosphere in the room had changed for good. Crockett answered each question with the same accuracy and deep knowing she had shown against Thomas. The other judges, having witnessed the earlier exchange, now treated her with much more respect. Thomas stayed quiet for most of the rest of the presentation, sometimes whispering to Judge Alito but asking no more questions. His attempt to publicly put down Crockett had failed badly, and everyone in the room knew it. When the session ended, Crockett gathered her things with calm skill. As she turned to leave the speaker's stand, she briefly made eye with Judge Thomas. She gave him a slight, formal nod, neither triumphant nor submissive. It was like one legal mind recognizing another. Thomas didn't return the nod, but the slight tightening of his mouth told observers all they needed to know about who had won this unexpected court clash. Jasmine Crockett walked down the Supreme Court's famous stone steps as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. Reporters swarmed her, mics and recorders out. Her run-in with Justice Thomas had already caused a stir in Washington's political and legal circles. Representative, what's your answer to Justice Thomas's attacks on your legal qualifications? A reporter shouted. Crockett paused, adjusted her glasses, and said, I didn't come to the court to get into personal fights. I came to stand up for the voting rights of millions of people whose voices are being shut down. That's what I'm focused on. Her calm response only made the media more curious. By evening, clips of the exchange were all over the news. Everyone was talking about Crockett versus Thomas, sharing and commenting on their face-off. Right-wing outlets initially tried to paint Crockett as a rude congresswoman attacking a respected judge. Fox News ran the headline, Crockett breaks court etiquette with political stunt. But when the full transcript came out showing Thomas's personal attacks and Crockett's sharp, informed responses, the narrative quickly changed. Even I have to admit, she handled herself well, said a prominent right-wing legal analyst on CNN. Thomas threw everything he had at her, and she countered with specific facts and even his own words. That's just great lawyering. Left-leaning media hailed Crockett as a new legal star. An MSNBC legal commentator said, what we saw today was incredible. Justice Thomas, who rarely faces real opposition, met his match in Representative Crockett. She didn't just hold her own. She systematically dismantled his arguments by using his own legal philosophy against him. The moment Crockett quoted Thomas's own statements back to him went viral instantly. Memes flooded social media with variations of, those aren't my words, Justice Thomas, those are yours, popping up everywhere. Law schools across the country requested the transcript to use it in their advocacy classes. This exchange will be studied for years to come as a master class in staying calm under pressure and using an opponent's words to defeat their claims, said the dean of Harvard Law School, Crockett's alma mater. In the days that followed, the impact of the clash went beyond legal circles. For many people, especially young people of color considering legal careers, Crockett's performance was a powerful symbol. Here was a black woman from a modest background in Texas who had stood toe-to-toe with one of the most influential judges in the country and won through preparation and legal skill. Watching Representative Crockett handle Justice Thomas's questioning inspired me to apply to law school. One young woman posted in a message that got over 200,000 likes. She showed that with enough preparation and courage, you can stand up to anyone, no matter how powerful. Even some of Thomas's usual fans admitted he went too far. far. One well-known conservative legal expert wrote in the National Review, "No matter what you think of Representative Crockett's legal arguments, Judge Thomas's attacks on her were wrong and didn't help his case. The court's credibility depends on focusing on the law, not personal insults." Politically, it was a big deal, too. Crockett, who was already getting noticed by progressives, suddenly became nationally known. She got tons of requests to speak at law schools, bar associations, and political events. Progressive leaders saw her rising popularity and started giving her bigger roles in media appearances and meetings. For Thomas, it looked like a rare public blunder. He's known for being quiet and avoiding the press, so he stayed silent while everyone talked about the clash. But sources close to the court said he was secretly ticked off about how things played out and how the media portrayed it. 3 weeks later, the court announced its decision on the voting rights case. Surprisingly, the court struck down the Texas law in a 5-4 decision. Chief Justice Roberts sided with the liberal justices. While Roberts' reasoning stuck to the specifics of the Texas law, legal experts noticed that some of Crockett's main points showed up in the Chief Justice's opinion. Thomas wrote a sharp dissent, sticking to the legal issues and not mentioning the heated exchange during oral arguments. But in legal circles, the connection was clear. Crockett's strong performance had influenced the outcome and could affect voting rights law for years to come. That evening, Crockett held a short press conference on the steps of the Capitol. Surrounded by voting rights advocates and fellow lawmakers, she spoke with the same calm confidence she had shown at the Supreme Court. "Today's decision isn't about any one lawyer or judge," she said. "It's about the basic idea that everyone who's eligible to vote should have equal access to the ballot box. That idea is bigger than politics, personality, and even the Supreme Court." A reporter shouted, "Representative, some people are saying you taught Judge Thomas a lesson about underestimating black women lawyers. What do you say?" Crockett smiled slightly. "I didn't go to the Supreme Court to teach anyone lessons. I went to argue for voting rights using the tools every good lawyer uses: careful preparation, solid knowledge of the law, and the guts to stand your ground when challenged." She paused, then added, "But if there's a lesson here, maybe it's that we should all be judged by the strength of our arguments, not by assumptions about our abilities. That goes for a freshman lawmaker or a 30-year veteran of the Supreme Court." As the sun set behind the government building, casting a yellow glow on the stone steps, Jasmine Crockett's words resonated with people everywhere. In these divisive times, her actions showed that being prepared, informed, and sticking to your principles can still win out over power and position. The back and forth between Jasmine Crockett and Clarence Thomas will be talked about in law schools, government meetings, and chats about justice for years to come. It wasn't just a judge being silenced by a lawmaker. It was a firm reminder that in our legal system, even the most powerful people are answerable to reason and what they say. For young people everywhere, especially those from backgrounds not usually seen in the legal world, Crockett's story sends a powerful message. If you stand for something, know your stuff, and don't be afraid, you can change more than just one thing. You can change the course of justice. If you like this video about Jasmine Crockett standing up to Judge Thomas with facts and preparation, please like and subscribe. We bring you the government clashes and moments of justice that mainstream news won't show. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video where we'll talk about another heated argument between DC power players.